Hello everyone, welcome to this live. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the way avoidant attachers think in relation to people that they're getting closer to in terms of commitment, because I think that for many people, including myself, it seems incredibly baffling that people with avoidant attachment who seemingly like individuals that they're dating would choose to back out of these relationships if everything's hunky-dory. And I wanted to take this opportunity to advertise the book, Why Men Can't Love, because it's one of the best books I've read describing what it's like to be on the receiving end of someone who has severe avoidant attachment. Though the book was written back in like the late 1900s, it's a very good resource for understanding what it's like to understand these individuals with severe avoidant attachment, what it's like to validate your experience off the back of this, and also to realize that there is very little wiggle room or hope in these dynamics, and that so much of this rests on the person with avoidant attachment. And I wanted to take today's live to discuss an example of a scenario where someone with avoidant attachment gets with someone who's actually a reasonably, self-sufficient person, and how they rationalize getting out of said relationship, the before, the after. And I want to make a moment here to say that for people who have avoidant attachment who are listening to this live, I'm just going to say now this is probably going to be very triggering. For people who've been in an experience with someone who sounds similar to the example I'm about to provide, this is probably going to be triggering for you for different reasons. So I just want to say, please bear in mind that the aim of this is not to hopefully criticize or condemn the avoidant attacher and what they've done. It's really just to illustrate what's actually going on and how to pass out the responsibility of the person with the commitment issues versus the person who's on the receiving end of this. So with that all being said, let's dive in. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to throw them into the chat because I will happily answer them after I've done this. But I want to talk about this particular example, which I will probably just read straight from this book. And again, if anyone's interested in this, the book is called Men Who Can't Love by Stephen Carter. Highly recommend you go download a copy of that on a Kindle, buy a copy from Amazon, or listen to it on Audible if it exists. So for this particular example, we have a woman named Terry and a guy named Jack. Terry is a woman who seemingly has, let's just say maybe an anxious attachment. We're just making that as an assumption. And Jack has a history of commitment-related issues due to his avoidant attachment. So basically, if I'm summarizing their particular story, Terry had been dating Jack in this whirlwind-style relationship. She basically says, Jack really fooled me. Although he wasn't verbal, he was extraordinarily affectionate. Wherever we would walk, he would put his arm around me. He started calling me almost every day, and I knew where we were every night. He saw his children at least 3 nights a week, and he always told me what he was doing. And when he had his children, he seemed to want to be with me whenever he was free. I should also mention that for Jack, he makes it very clear that he's looking for a monogamous relationship. He had a lot of problems with his children, and he told me all sorts of intimate details about his life. He had said he had problems with his ex-wife, who was still very jealous and kept tabs on him. Although he didn't say, "I love you, I need you," he sort of indicated through his actions that he wanted something more than just a casual relationship. It took us a while to get round to sex because I was dragging my heels, but he planned dates where that sort of logical progression leads to sex. The second date, he went dancing. He held my hand, and as the night went on, we danced more closely together, and it became more sensual, more agreeable. He was more than affectionate, and the sex was just a slow, easy progression. It was very easy to get to know him and also to get into this physical act. I remember one Saturday afternoon date when I had to leave early. Jack was particularly amorous and didn't want to leave. He didn't want to leave me, and I wasn't particularly sure where I wanted the relationship to go. He didn't tell me he wanted something long-term, but he certainly implied it. Sorry, just for context, I know I said earlier that he was interested in a long-term relationship. For the context of this story, he is, even though he may not have explicitly stated it. I think it was 2 dates later when we slept together for the first time, and it was very nice that he articulated this. By this time, we were seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week, and he was calling me almost every day. He made a point of always telling me where he was going to be. He would ask me out on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Those were the nights he didn't have his kids. In any event, once we were sleeping together, it changed. I sensed it immediately. We still saw each other as often, but he somehow became different. He'd been very warm, very loving, and then he abruptly shut down. I wondered what I was doing. It made me very self-conscious, and I tried to discuss it, but he sort of brushed off my attempt. You know, when you're in a relationship that's still relatively new and you don't know the man that well, it could be anything, he had all these problems, I didn't want to be another problem. So I just tried to be supportive and understanding. But he got uncomfortable about sex, it was obvious. He didn't want me to sleep at his house and started leaving me at the door saying he had to see his children in the morning. It was apparent he didn't want to sleep with me anymore. He told me that it was because of his ex-wife, that he was basically saying he was feeling uncomfortable about the sex. He still felt that he was married to his ex-wife, and I'd felt sorry for him. He didn't want me to stay over in his apartment. He didn't want to stay over in mine. I was getting to like him very much, and I remember once telling him just to say hello, and I could tell it made him uncomfortable. He said his youngest son told his wife that there's this woman Terry who keeps calling Dad. This was obviously a big problem for him. I didn't pay much attention to it, but he made a big deal out of it. He indicated that it created a crisis with his children, and it made me uncomfortable about calling him. For whatever reason, the relationship was not turning out the way I would have hoped. I'm not aggressive. I didn't argue with him or try to prolong it. I just said, let's forget it. At the beginning, I didn't realize how involved he was with his ex-wife. It wasn't clear to me at all. I knew he had a close relationship with the children, but he didn't mention his wife. When he talked about any of his wives, it was past tense. He was very guilty about them, particularly the first, very troubled. I think the second marriage was very short, and then he had a lot of problems with his third wife. But he was very warm and he seemed very sensitive. I think he was a lovely person, and I still have good feelings about him. If I were to express my anger to him, I think I would want to say to him, why did you start up with me? We didn't have to go to bed, we could have just been friends. Why did you start up, then shut down and say goodbye? But it's hard to really get angry at him because I think he was screwed up. I don't think he intended things to end the way they did. I think he got scared. He wrote me a letter saying I deserved more and a better relationship than the one he could offer me. I called him and he took me out to dinner and I cried. I said that I was really sad that we couldn't have a relationship. He told me this story about how he rented an apartment, he rented a TV, he rented a car, that everything in his life was very temporary. He couldn't even make a commitment to buy anything. I felt very sorry for him because I don't think he wanted to hurt me. I don't think he dates much. He just seems to be lonely and he didn't like to be alone. Now let's skip forward to the way Jack, the partner Terry was dating, describes his version of the events. Now I want to take a moment here to say that for anyone who's about to listen to this, their blood might boil, understandably. So take a minute just to hear what the avoidant attacher has to say in describing Terry. I liked Terry. We had a lot of fun on our first date. I asked her out for the next night. We went to dinner on a Friday night. I took her home, and I remember that I called her the next day and asked if she wanted to see a movie with me that night. She said, great. We had a lot of dates, 4 or 5 nights in a row. I was very attracted to her at first. The first time we slept together, she stayed over. After that, I guess I didn't want her around. Sometimes I just felt pressured by her. I thought she would want something more. Sometimes it really was because the kids were going to call me or something was going on. I have a hard time dealing with a woman when the children are around because my dealings with the children often involve their mother. My ex-wife and I have sort of an odd relationship. Some people wouldn't understand it. We still sleep together. It works out better this way. When we were living together, she was never interested in sex. Now we see each other often and we sleep together maybe once every 10 days or so. How could I tell Terry that? When Terry spent the night, I would want her to leave by 8 in case my wife or the kids called. I never told my wife I was seeing other women, and she would have had a jealous fit if she found out. What I usually did was tell Terry that the kids were coming over. She said that it felt as though the kids were getting dropped off earlier and earlier. I never stayed at her house because I worried about my wife calling and my not being home if she called in the middle of the night, which she does sometimes. Anyway, with Terry, this pattern developed where I was less and less available. One night, she invited me to her house for dinner. Her roommate was away, and it was apparent she expected me to stay over. She sensed that I wasn't going to, and she said, "You're not going to stay over, are you?" And I said, "No." And she said, "I'm furious. I'm really angry. It's not your fault, but I'm really furious. So why don't you leave now?" I did, and then when I got home, I wrote her this long letter. I told her that she deserved more than I was giving her. She's a lovely person, and I didn't want to hurt her. She got the letter and suggested dinner to talk about it. We went to dinner, and she said that I should have slept with her. If I hadn't, we could have been friends. But now she didn't want me as a friend. She said she had enough friends, and she indicated that, as I thought, she wanted a permanent relationship. I suspect the overriding reason the relationship didn't work out was because of what was going on with my wife. If it hadn't been for that, if I'd met Terry at another time, it might have been different. That's what women always say to me. They always tell me that they wish they had met me at another time, when I was more emotionally available. I think they would like to analyze me, but I never see anyone long enough for them to take that latitude. In my emotional life, I often seem to have two women, neither one of whom is totally satisfying. When I left my first wife, it was for another woman. Same thing with wife number 2. Now with wife number 3, we're not together, but we are, and I see other women. Another reason things didn't work out with Terry is that I don't really like blondes. I prefer women with dark hair. I was attracted to her to start out with. She was very feminine, but she really wasn't my type. However, as I say this, I realize that if it weren't for my wife, if I had met Terry in a vacuum, she might be very attractive to me. That was another problem with Terry though, and this really bothered me. She was too affectionate. She touched me all the time, not at the beginning, but at the end, I felt as though the touching was ever present. If I moved to another seat, she moved with me. I couldn't go anywhere I couldn't go anywhere without her being right there. She was too clutchy. If it weren't for my wife and I, though there was a reason to work on the relationship, I might have said something about it, but it didn't make sense to make her crazy by saying anything. Okay, so that is one of many accounts of someone with commitment phobia. And I gotta say, that example is something that I've heard in a lot of client cases where it doesn't just happen in a heteronormative setting. It doesn't just happen in, a case where this is the dude and the woman is anxious to secure. It can happen the other way too. So let's go over the details of this. Personally, I relate more to Terry in this example. I relate to her being dumbstruck, confused, and really put off by the fact that in this case, Jack didn't disclose that he actually still had a wife in the picture, and that he also used his kids as a buffer in order to separate himself from getting any closer with Terry. On top of that too, if we now turn to some of the things that Jack's done, which is very interesting, and I could dissect this man all day based on the information. It's kind of like what I do with my clients, so this is kind of like what it's like when I'm sort of going through it all. I find it fascinating that this guy made the assumption to lie about all of his experiences with his current wife, to not have an issue with not only Terry, but also not to disclose his affair with his wife, because he was worried about what the potential outcome might be, where both of these women have an emotional reaction. Which, by the way, would be very understandable if either of them found out. But it's just interesting how many avoidant attachers have this real belief that the right thing to do is to just not say anything because it's for the best. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying in one of my lives many moons ago, that a lot of this is the pathway to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think what's really scary is the fact that for a lot of these people, they don't disclose a lot of this pertinent information to people, and it's not a good thing to do. But that's not all. I also want to throw in there too this rationalization that Terry wasn't his type. I know many people at the height of a breakup are told, yeah, I just don't think you're my type. I'm just not that attracted to you. We were just madly infatuated. What this book does a really good job of describing is how the avoidant attacher will rationalize to hell how to get out of a relationship or a situationship with someone. Their brain will go from fondness to terror. They'll sober up and they'll see all these flaws in the other person, which they then use to mentally construct their reasons to leave. And saying, well, they're just not my type, becomes one of the many reasons that they use, in spite of the fact that even though this person may not have been their type, they were perfectly willing to get emotionally intimate and physically intimate for a time. The other thing too, which is really interesting for this, is the fact that for Terry, I think what's really terrifying is the fact that it's very easy, I think, to internalize a lot of this and to assume that maybe she's done something wrong, that she's been too needy. And many avoidant attachers do feel like, you know what, it is the Terry in my situation that's causing me to feel this pressure. Her being so affectionate, it's too much. I feel like she wants more from me. I want to take a moment here just to acknowledge and say, look, I admit I sound a bit critical of the avoidant person in this particular situation, but I also want to say something that's really important. Please be very careful. If you are someone with avoidant attachment, it's very important to understand that your emotions do a big flip-flop, and it is very easy to trust the feelings that are coming up rather than being present in the moment. Ironic, because I know a lot of you love to say, I just want to go with the flow. But I know how hard it is because many avoidant attachers, as this book does a great job of describing, suffer tremendous anxiety, where they worry that if we're going to have commitment, it's somehow going to mean that I am a failure, there's something that's going to be wrong with me in this relationship, people won't like me because I ruined this relationship. For example, they could be dating someone and they could be internalizing in their head once the declaration of a relationship is made, and they could be the one who say they want a relationship with their partner. They may say the words, I want marriage, I love you, and then what happens is their brain goes to thinking way too far ahead in the future, thinking, oh my God, this is it, this is final. What if this doesn't work out? I don't know if I'm going to be any good for this person. I don't know if I can meet their needs. I think they're going to find that I'm not able to support them or even raise kids. It's just going to be a disaster. So like I've said before, a lot of internalized panic that's happening internally. And of course, they don't usually disclose a lot of this to you. So as a consequence, when someone with avoidant attachment starts to really believe a lot of this stuff, it becomes a bit of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, they do find relief when they step away from the relationship, maybe entirely. But even though they may feel temporary relief off the back of this, they're then often flooded with depression, sadness, guilt, grief, where they do miss the individual that they were dating. It's important to understand that if you have avoidant attachment, you are usually bombarded by big emotions that come up around the theme of commitment. And it becomes very easy to turn the right person wrong to justify your escape. And it is something that unfortunately is very hardwired into a lot of avoidant attachers. I'm not making an excuse for the trauma that it causes for the recipient, but I'm just saying it's important to realize that this is a very automatic response for a lot of people. Going back to this particular case between Terry and Jack, I also think it's important to also talk about the fact that even though Jack, yes, I made a mistake, I thought he said he wanted a monogamous relationship, does seem to give the inclination of wanting monogamy, he's clearly in a bit of a benign, ethical, non-monogamous situation, which I don't really think is that ethical because his wife hasn't consented to it. And it's interesting how he's also positioned his wife in such a way where she's being played while he gets to do whatever he wants to do on the side in a very clumsy manner, I might add. Many avoidant attachers are often accused of being players. Many of them are considered to be people who are just pitting other women against one another. But a lot of this stuff in a heteronormative male to women setting, and this can be across genders or sexuality, aren't usually intending to do this, to the women in their lives under this particular example. They're not necessarily trying to play other people out in some sort of Machiavellian game. Much of the time, this is done to manage their own fear of commitment and getting close with someone. One thing that this book does a really good job of, and this is also present in this example, is describing how an avoidant attacher can still be married to someone, but those fears of intimacy and commitment, those real fears that cause them to cheat in the first place, to leave a relationship abruptly, may only come up a bit later down the line if there's certain things that make them feel like this is forever, if they feel like they're getting triggered by the other person in terms of their closeness and their intimacy. And I think it does a really good job of describing how, yes, the avoidant attacher may have demonstrated commitment, but it does not necessarily mean they're capable of sustaining commitment, and that even if they're in the seemingly committed relationship, it might also not be a very functional one. In the case of Jack with his wife, whilst there isn't really any evidence to suggest that his existing wife is necessarily behaving badly with him, there does seem to be a lot of emotional distance between them. So it might mean that for him, he's able to just do whatever he wants, and for the poor wife, she may be in a position where she doesn't feel like she's getting any of her emotional needs met, and may have just quietly given up because she doesn't know what to do. Many times, even if the avoidant attacher is complaining about the husband, the wife, the partner who they're with, it may be because they've actually behaved in such a way to try and remove themselves from them. Going back to what I was saying before about how a lot of the emotional stuff that's going on inside of an avoidant also dictates them thinking, it can also dictate the way in which they speak about their partner to others. They might rewrite history and say things like, well, my partner was just too needy, too affectionate, and it's not really the truth of the matter. Many times people often feel like they've been gaslit by these encounters because they'll look back on it and go, that's not how I remember it. And even this account where Jack is describing the relationship with Terry, where he's saying, oh, she was too affectionate, she wasn't my type, is blatantly not accurate in this particular case. I want to take a moment here when it says 25% of the world population has avoidant attachment. I'm going to bump that up a notch. Try 50%. It's just a staggering number. I also want to take a moment here to say, I really have grown to dislike Attached as a book. I thought it was a great introductory guide to understanding attachment theory, but it has fundamentally missed the mark in a lot of key areas. That's a conversation for another time, but I just want to say that the more you understand this sort of stuff, the more I feel like Attached made a lot of generalized assumptions and didn't really understand a lot of the nuance and the spectrum of a lot of this stuff to the point where it's actually relevant and helping people. I also think too that Attached romanticizes this idea that the avoidant and the anxious partner can heal their wounds together and become secure. And I know they make a claim that it's better for the anxious to be with a secure and avoidant to be with a secure, and that that's the preferable arrangement. But I also want to make it clear, and this book does a great job of it, if the other person, regardless of their attachment style, but in this particular case, obviously avoidant attachment, is not willing to work on themselves, particularly with a therapist, there is no hope. And this book has a great section at the very end where it describes how, for the most part, it does take the willingness and motivation of an avoidant attacher in therapy to work on this, excuse me, and that many people will not overcome their fear of commitment. So, just to round out this, I just want to say that if you are someone who is dating someone with avoidant attachment, it is so important not to personalize the flip-flop of emotions that are coming up for them. I may do a particular live talking about the strategies that you need to take and the radical acceptance you need to have if you are in a relationship, because there are some really good parts that this book describes that I would just love to quote for everyone because it's just on point. And it's actually, for me, it's been very reassuring to read this because for a book that was written 30 plus years ago, to have been able to accurately describe things that we're still seeing in this day and age, I think is phenomenal. So please go check out the book, Men Who Can't Love. And again, if you are a man who dated an avoidant, if you are a non-binary person, if you are part of the LGBTQI plus experience, please do yourself a favor and just mentally change the pronouns, because it is still relevant for a lot of people. And they do acknowledge in the book that this is an experience where women can also have commitment phobia as well too. So it's not just one of those old sexist fuddy-duddy stories that came out back in the day, which doesn't, you know, delineate across sexuality. So just want to put it out there and say it's still a phenomenal read. With that being said, I will happily take any questions that you have for me. And yeah, again, just couldn't recommend that book any further. I will probably continue to do a few lives where I extrapolate bits and pieces from it and maybe do some case studies, because I think that it is a really, really good book. I also want to say too, and just because I can see here that this person says, bro made me curious by saying 50% of the world is avoidantly attached. I want to make it clear, I'm biased because I've been working with these kind of, you know, situations with clients on a, you know, a daily basis. So maybe I'm completely off as well too, but I definitely don't think avoidant attachment is just 25% of the population. I'm like, no way. That's just a personal thought. But again, I don't have actual statistics, but I think a rounded number like 25%, come on. And I know I'm not helping by saying 50%. Okay, what did dismissive avoidance think about marriage? Okay, this is a really good point that's even covered in this particular book too, which is to say that for many of the severe avoidants who, you know, think about marriage, it's the ultimate trap. They have this fear that it's going to be boring when they get into marriage, that there's going to be nothing to do. They're worried about being locked down, losing their independence, and being in a position where they feel like they're just not able to have any freedom. Many of them value their independence, their privacy, their space, and the thought of seceding any of that to another person really frightens them. And a part of their brain has grown due to their childhood to really try and get them out of environments where they feel like they have to give too much themselves to other individuals. That is why in these particular experiences, it's very important to understand that for a dismissive avoidant, even if they get to marriage, usually in the back of their head, they have an exit strategy because they don't necessarily want to stick around for all that long. And as this book also validates, many avoidant attachers, including the dismissers and the fearful avoidants, will often stick it out in unhealthy and bad relationships because they always know they can pin the blame on the other person if it all goes to shit, whereas they often find it much harder to actually get away with that when they're in a functional relationship. I want to take actually a moment to say, because I forgot to mention that, and that was actually really interesting. So this book did a really good job of also documenting how, for many avoidant attachers, when they rationalize getting out of a seemingly reasonable relationship with someone, they actually struggle to come up with reasons to leave. Part of their negative thinking obviously looks for flaws, but what's really fascinating is they don't want to take ownership of the fact that they're the problem, that they've got something wrong with them, that they've actually got an issue that's preventing them from love. And so often they'll create all these reasons as to why the person is not good for them. Whereas if they're in a known relationship where there are big issues, this is what's really interesting, is they know that there are tons of issues in the relationship. Hell, they may have even contributed to them. Sometimes they will try and provoke a fight with their partner to get a rise out of them. And sometimes they're even hoping that their partner will break the relationship up on their behalf so they can get a clean slate to walk out of it so they don't have to feel like a bad person. Much of the time, they can engineer the end of a relationship in order to help them feel like they've done the right thing and that they weren't a problem. It's also important to understand that for a lot of these people, when they are in the dysfunctional relationships, that often acts as their safety net because then they never have to feel guilty for leaving this person, and it makes them feel safe. So often, a lot of the times, the way they position people in a very, I suppose, subconscious way is done to protect their ego, is designed to also help them not have to worry about this idea of commitment phobia. Because even naming that they have commitment phobia can be something that sends them off into a massive spiral, and they don't like to address the fact that they actually have a problem with love. Someone, I think, asked what was the percentage of avoidants who go to therapy to become secure. I don't know. I don't work with a large client base that are avoidantly attached. No surprise there, because I'm obviously working with people who are off the back of those, relationships and situationships. But I'm sure there are probably academic sources that talk about, people who do, because there are books about this. Like there's a really good books like Trauma and the Avoidant Client, who talk about, what it's like as clinicians working for people who have avoidant attachment and the process of working through those, sessions to help them to open up. And it's very prolonged, and it's not easy because these individuals have very tight defense mechanisms. In fact, I was chatting with a colleague about it today, saying that I can be with a client and discuss, say, hey, let's just do some journaling and reflect on some of the thoughts that you have around commitment and just understand, like, what does this mean for you? And the client will often say, who has avoidant attachment, my God, this is the deepest I've ever gone. And for me, someone who's no stranger to reflecting on the reasons as to why I do things, I'm like, really? Like, you think this is deep? It's like saying that doing basic algebra is complicated maths to someone who may be doing all kinds of equations for rocket science. And I'm not trying to say I'm a rocket scientist with my emotions, but I'm just simply trying to say that it's like, you think this is hard? Like there are other obviously much more complicated things that come out in the process. And it really is just to illustrate that it's just an unexplored world for many avoidant attachers to actually go through Pandora's box and actually work through a lot of this stuff. One point that actually came up in this book, which I found fascinating, was the fact that many avoidant attachers ruminate on commitment and actually being able to commit to anything at all. Much of the time, apparently, they vacillate between making big decisions. They're very indecisive. I've had avoidant clients say to me, yeah, I can't actually decide what I'm going to do with a partner because I'm worried that if I tell them what I want to do, they're going to, think it's crap and stop wanting to be with me. So they're very self-conscious and insecure about making decisions in a lot of ways. I've also mentioned on lives too how it sometimes feels like the avoidant partner can be quite passive in a relationship and you feel like they don't really know what they want or what they need. And so they kind of just go with the flow in a very sort of annoying way for people where they feel like there's never any directional structure to what's going on too. So just wanted to take that little segue to say a few more pieces from the book. And I know that, it was... I know that was a bit of a tangent. And yes, I will save this live, don't worry. Let's see, back to the questions. My dismissive avoidant loves me, but still cannot talk about the future beyond a few months. Says he can't see past his time in his mind and lives in the present. He becomes very stressed when I ask about the future. Why? Well, this is a great way to segue back to the book. For a lot of avoidant attachers, even though they say they're in the present, when they say they're avoiding the future, the funny thing is that they often live in the future because they have tremendous anxiety that's often gone undiagnosed. And for them, the future is a source of panic. It's a source of being boxed in, feeling claustrophobic in a relationship. And even if they say things like, yeah, I just can't see us being in a future together, it's not because you two don't make a great couple. It's because they have created this idea in their head that being in a committed relationship is death, that it is the end of their world, that the walls are going to come crashing in. And so I think for someone like that, believe him when he says he loves you, because I genuinely believe that he does. But the idea of, losing his sense of self, his independence, not being good enough for you, there are so many themes to this, is probably something that really hits him like a truck. Like I said in my previous anecdote about my experience with avoidant attached clients, is that, like I said, they're not really used to introspection and reflecting on their thoughts and their feelings. So if they're avoiding a lot of that anxiety like the plague, it's probably because they don't have the resilience to actually work through it. It is a lot. It is very intense stuff to work through. And I don't want to shame anyone with avoidant attachment to say this, because it's hard. If you've grown up in an environment where you weren't able to really work on this sort of stuff, then naturally, if you're constantly being bombarded by these big emotions and triggers and you're just trying to shove it all down, it can be really tough. This also leads me to say too, I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but it also leads me to say too that, their time with you, the past, can also be something that they try to shove down. They can be very good at compartmentalizing their time with you, their experiences of fondness for you, in order to do a few things. One of which can be to not reflect too hard on the past because it brings up too many painful memories. And it also comes with the fact that they'd have to recognize, oh, wait, yeah, shit, I actually was the common denominator in that relationship and I was the reason why it broke up. I know it might seem heavy-handed to suggest that like all avoidant attachers do this, because they don't. But the severe ones typically are much more egregious in terms of how they behave and how they blow up relationships. That's where we see a lot of ghosting and no explanations for what's going on. It's wild to think that ghosting was going on decades before it became a coined term, that once upon a time it wasn't the absence of a text exchange, that it was in fact someone who just walked out in the middle of the night one night with no explanation. Maybe they'd leave a note saying, yeah, I'm in a dark place, I'll call back in 2 days, only to never follow up on that promise. Many of these individuals, even back in the day, have never really given their partners closure or a sense of any sort of validation for the experience, and they've left their partners to puzzle over and figure out what the heck just happened. So this has been a very time-old experience, and I suspect this has probably been something that's been going on for centuries, that we've only now just started to realize, oh, this is a thing that we need to think about. And the book makes some interesting points about how perhaps this was maybe something that came out as a consequence of the sexual revolution, the fact that divorce wasn't a mandatory, divorce became more of a popular and also, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, divorce was something that you could do without as much shame as it once was. So there was more freedom to sort of do whatever you wanted. However, the book also makes a great claim that that wouldn't have stopped any one of these people with avoidant attachment from also going around and sleeping outside of their relationship with other people as well too. It's not going to stop them under most circumstances if they're feeling those intense fears of commitment and intimacy. So unfortunately, it is what it is in a lot of these sort of cases, and it's happened. But this is the thing they do in order to feel like they're no longer suffocating and drowning. I also want to take another moment to, and again, I know I'm going all over the shop today, but I had so many things that come out for me as I'm talking about this, to also say too that I often find a lot of avoidant attachers will project and blame a lot of people, whether it be women, men, anxious attachers, for being too suffocating, too needy, to avoid having to face their own stuff. Yes, it is true that there can be people who display opposing behavior that is problematic. But it is also very possible for many of these individuals to project hard and to make it seem like all anxious attachers are the devil, when in fact they are exaggerating over how bad it actually is. For example, if we go back to the case study that I was reading out earlier, we see Jack basically saying that Terry was too affectionate when all she was doing was trying, I think from reflection, to get closer to him on a romantic date together. And it doesn't sound to me like she was doing anything outrageous, like trying to pin him down on a bed, lock him up, and that's extreme, or do anything that was outrageously needy, like call him all the time or to try and constantly get validation from him. It is amazing how in the negative thinking of someone who's avoidantly attached, they can absolutely exaggerate the truth in order to make it fit the narrative that something is wrong with the other person, in order to avoid taking accountability for the fact that they have either caused, created, or are responsible for said situation. It happens. I'm not shaming the avoidant attachers who do it. It just happens. I know it happens because there's documented evidence of this. I can see it happening with my clients, and I'm like, okay, it is what it is, I suppose. But again, you guys can have whatever thoughts and feelings about this as you like. So if you feel particularly triggered by it, you're welcome to feel triggered by it, because believe me, I can say a part of me had my blood boiling as I was reading some of this, and I was like, oh, not cool. So yeah, just saying, I know avoidant attachers why you do it, but just understand we don't love history being rewritten and making it seem like we're crazy when we're not. Anyways, back to the questions. I understand the diagnostic difference between avoidance and cluster Bs, but you named a lot of similarities here. Okay, I'm going to just take a moment to say I was dwelling on this exact subject today about diagnostic criteria and avoidant attachment. So I'm going to make a big hypothesis in just a hot second, but before we get there, I'm going to finish reading out this particular question. What's your opinion on that from the other external lash and partner's everyday life perception of them? Would you say they check enough boxes and also to be diagnosed as cluster Bs? I'm going to get shot somewhere for saying what I'm about to say. My current hypothesis is to say that people with severe avoidant attachment, based on my experience, do I think deserve a criteria unto themselves. And it might be something that I reflect back on in the future and say, I think that's a bit harsh. I think that's not necessarily right. But I want to make a claim for this. The cost of being with these individuals as a consequence of what happens to the public health, where people often have tremendous harm to them, you know, where they feel suicidal, highly depressed, highly anxious. They are in a situation where the toll that happens to a lot of people as a consequence of being in these situations and relationships is so damn significant. I actually think it needs to have some form of criteria because it's not fair to so many people who go through this. One might say that, you know, on one hand, we live in an environment where, you know, it is what it is. It's like if you're scuba diving. We know that there are fish in the sea, and I'm not trying to compare avoidant attachers to sharks, but sharks exist. Sharks also are not always biters. Sometimes they're curious and they just want to sniff you like a dog before you have to put your hand up and be like, off you go. To people who scuba dive, you know what I'm talking about. But the point simply is to say that we do live in a world where there are plenty of avoidant attachers and they are, you know, for the most part, actually reasonable and great people on paper for a lot of things. Even this book acknowledges these individuals do truly love the people they get with. They have tremendous capacity to love and they have tremendous capacity to be entertaining, fun, free-spirited individuals. That being said, we also have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Which leads me to say, I think that whilst extremely anxious attachment behavior also may deserve a criteria unto itself due to, like, you know, severe insecure attachment, maybe linking that with themes of codependency and whatever other comorbidities might be there. Because of course this is going to depend from person to person because not everyone's going to be severe in this particular criteria. But I do think that when it comes to what we're looking at here, the distorted thinking, which can also be similar to splitting, the cost to the public health as a consequence of interacting with these individuals, what else was I going to say? The extreme, okay, this is another one. Extreme committophobia. If it was just commitment phobia, I'd say not enough to, you know, even though there are plenty of like phobias in the DSM-5, like fear of peanut butter, and also fears of like jelly, which are a bit weird. If it was just that, I would be like, I don't think it's a big deal. But it's more than that. Emotional dysregulation, often tied in with CPTSD, often also tied in with a lot of other comorbidities too. Like if you do, like people who have severe avoidant attachment, when they often get brain scans, there's often signs where it suggests that these individuals are over-rationalizing and not using a lot of their emotional intelligence in a lot of areas. And there is tremendous suppression of a lot of their triggers. So please let it be said, this is a hypothesis. I am not trying to condemn or say that people with avoidant attachment are cluster B personalities. I'm not trying to suggest that these individuals are necessarily have something wrong with them. Maybe, in fact, having this criteria would actually be helpful to be like, hey, we can identify that there is these things that are actually happening, and you can, if you choose to, maybe have a name for this and an opportunity to work on it. But it's important to understand that there are significant obstacles for you compared to people who may not necessarily have this criteria of what they're going through. I understand too that this is a bit of a dangerous thing to be saying, and a lot of people may not necessarily agree with what I'm saying, but I'm just going to throw out there and say, I do think people need to take a look at this more seriously, because a lot of these individuals with avoidant attachment are not going to therapy. They're not also willing to take accountability for their stuff because of their defensiveness. And I do think that there needs to be some form of acknowledgement for this, because there are a lot of people who are suffering as a consequence of these relationships. Yes, the avoidant attachers, and we have to acknowledge them too. They're suffering from this too. A lot of them do not want to be this way. Some of them will rationalize and say, I like myself this way. But if they're really honest with themselves, many of them are actually quite depressed, lonely, anxious folk who often feel deeply misunderstood and often feel like nobody really knows how to connect with them. And they also know that at times they feel like the architect of their own demise in many of their relationships. So it is one of those things where I'd say maybe we need to look at this more than just a style of attachment and more as something like it needs maybe a bit more of a rigorous underpinning to properly understand it. I think just simply saying, and this is why I don't particularly like the book Attached anymore, because I think just calling it an attachment style, like it's a star sign, is not doing justice to the complexity, the intensity of this experience for the people who are experiencing avoidant attachment and those who are on the receiving end of this. So that's why I think that, it's really important to understand that it is a dual experience for both people. Is there a self-assessment quiz which category of attachment style? I think that means with a category of attachment style. I don't know of any outside of the one that's often used, and I think that's the same one that the book Attached uses. And I have to say, to the Attached's credit, great assessment quiz. But personally, because we know that bias is a big influencing factor on quizzes, let me start that sentence again. User bias is a huge thing that can influence the results of individual quizzes. So that's where I'd probably say it'd be much better for people to actually go and seek out help from an objective professional, because that's something that needs to be addressed. I just saw someone here say, I thought there was something called avoidant personality disorder. Avoidant personality disorder, I actually don't know very much about, other than the fact that I often summarize it in a very overly simplistic way as basically saying that's essentially someone who's like an extreme introvert and someone who doesn't really get out that much and has like extreme like self-esteem related challenges. And again, that's just my extremely reductive, overly simplistic and probably not entirely accurate assessment of that personality disorder. So please do not use me as a reference for that. But it is not the same as people who have avoidant attachment. Even though people with severe avoidant attachment do seemingly have a lot of striking similarities in their disposition, their thinking, their feeling, and also their behavior. So maybe that's why, again, we need to reconsider whether it actually is something that's influencing personality. Or maybe if it's not influencing personality, maybe influencing mood, disposition, interpersonal experiences. So that's what I'd say there. Let's see, what else have we got here? How to keep healing when you keep bumping into my fearful avoidance situationship X every day because the town is so small. Personally, I would say that if it were me in that situation, it's not very easy because like an addict who's going through recovery, you're essentially being tempted with cocaine and your nervous system is probably responding to that. In that it's very difficult to feel safe in an experience where you know that there is a reminder of someone who has dysregulated your nervous system. So I would say that when it comes to being with someone in a small town who has a fearful avoidant attachment style and you're still interacting with them all day, I would say it's going to be hard to try and reduce contact. If it were me, I'd start by putting at least any memorabilia I had at home in a box or just getting rid of it entirely. I'd maybe plan out different routes. I would also definitely consider speaking to a specialist about how you're feeling through this, definitely to try and focus on how to help you not be so triggered by encounters with your ex, and definitely doing a similar technique we often advise people who are in narcissistic relationships to definitely find ways to grey rock or at the very least go low contact with these people, just so that way you don't feel so triggered. I often find a lot of people feel deeply discombobulated if they bump into an ex because it can be quite painful to have that reminder. So I'm just putting it out there and saying you may need to find some, solutions that really benefit you and also to help you feel like you have some boundaries with this. Is there any way we can detect in advance before we get deep with an avoidant? Again, I'm going to quote from the book that I've been referencing all day just to say there can be. Usually there is a trend for many avoidant attachers to be very hot and heavy with a lot of their potential partners. And this is where I'd say it's really important to do a lot of things that I've mentioned in previous lives with colleagues as well, which is definitely take the time to ask a lot of open questions and get to know these people better. Find out how they've dealt with previous relationships, how they navigate conflict, figure out how they also approach commitment, what their thoughts are on that. This book makes some really good points, which I've even echoed in previous cases as well too, where I've said, take it slow. If they want to rush, be the author of that relationship and drive it to a much slower pace, because even though it can be tempting to act on the chemistries, the butterflies, and this enthusiasm you're getting from this person, and I know for people, when you're dating people with avoidant attachment, many of them can be very attractive people, and it can be very easy for our egos to be like, I just want to be in bed with this individual and to seal the deal. But I can assure you that is a big mistake if you try and match their pace in trying to be with someone like this. It is far better to take it so much slower and to just put your ego to one side and focus more on feeling safe when you are pacing yourself, because it's not a good idea to try and run 90 miles an hour with them when they themselves aren't being realistic with their own attachment style. So just putting it out there and saying, you need to really think about your own self in these cases. And frankly, unlike conventional thinking, you might be like, well, won't my partner feel like I'm not necessarily being nice to them if I don't, respond eagerly, if I'm not necessarily being nice for them? I'm here to let you know, avoidant attachers are wired for chaotic relationships. You can actually leave them on red for longer than a day. They're not going to care too much. Like, frankly, I know it seems like unconventional wisdom to be saying that, because a lot of people will be like, well, you need to be consistent in your actions. Not with avoidance. With them, kindness, consistency, empathy, when they're triggered, will be the death knell of a relationship. It's important to understand that for many avoidant attachers, when they're triggered into their avoidancy, the last thing they want is your love, kindness, empathy. That sends them into a froth of feeling too much panic. So don't think that being more nice, more kind, doing more of what you've done probably in the honeymoon phase is necessarily going to equate to them feeling better. It often does the reverse. So just want to state that I also think that psychoeducation on this really helps, because it does give you a bit of access back to a lot of the logic of this and being like, okay, if I think I'm dating with someone with avoidant attachment, if they're pulling away, I don't like the concept of matching energy. But when they pull away, you really need to think about pulling away not for them, but for you, because you need to protect your emotional well-being and your psychological well-being if you start to feel a hot and cold cycle come on, because it's not fair to you if this person, without any explanation of what they're doing, is starting to pull away and you're also left in a position where you feel like there's a vacuum in the pit of your stomach and you feel as though this person's just abandoned you for a moment. Please put yourself first in these dynamics. They're technically doing the same when they're triggered. And it's important for you to make sure that you're putting your own interests before theirs when this happens. I know this is very unconventional sort of stuff that you would hear from people on this sort of subject, but at the end of the day, if they're not willing to recognize how they're behaving in a relationship and working on it, it's not up to you to figure this out for them. They have to be willing and wanting to do this work for themselves. And let's see. Would you say avoidants often contradict themselves or change their motivations for ending things? Yes. Very frequently they contradict themselves. Very frequently they change their motivations for when they're in a relationship. You can be with someone where you've had the most magical holiday where they're planning the future with you only before they end things with you 2 days later. Many of these people have very sudden change of mind. And it's not the normal change of mind that happens for people under regular circumstances. This change of mind happens due to an intensity of anxiety and often causes people to be bewildered at how this person can go from a rush of joy to a rush of panic in the space of a heartbeat. It happens. Sometimes it's been brewing beneath the surface for a very long time. So please bear in mind that a lot of the time they will change the narrative in order to justify how they're feeling, in order to not necessarily look like the bad person on the way out of the situationship and relationship. Let's see. They're supposed to be no, I think I can see that was connected to the previous one. He said he loves me, wanted me to move in, etc. Now pretending like he never said all those things. Is this some form of deactivation strategy? I'd say it's part of the rationalization that they're using in order to avoid accountability for what they're doing, which is a deactivation strategy. Meaning that them pulling away would be what I call the deactivation strategy. Them now, acting and speaking like they never meant that is a rationalization for the deactivation strategy. So I hope that makes sense. And yes, that links very nicely to the question that I just answered before, which is this person's changing the narrative in order to suit how they're feeling in the moment, which is not cool for you. I know why they're doing it. They're trying to protect themselves, but doesn't have a great impact on you. Let's see what else. Oh, I actually want to take a moment here because this is really important to say. Many avoidant attachers would dread to think that they're actually hurting someone. This often does come from a bit of an egotistical place because they don't want to think of themselves as bad people. But I want to reiterate that they're not monsters. They can do monstrous things, but many of them would hate to think that their behavior has led to feeling like they've put someone into therapy. They really cannot stand the thought that they've done something that bad to an individual who they really cared about. But often the ones who end up working on themselves and having a come to Jesus moment, if you will, and starting to work through their attachment style, often realize, oh yeah, I've got a few people that I need to reach out to and apologize to. So I will say that they're not doing this from a place of trying to intentionally screw people. They actually can be very sympathetic. They can actually be very sweet, sensitive people when they're obviously not in their avoidant activation. They're actually generally quite normal. Let's change that word. They're generally very mild-mannered, very gentle, sweet individuals. But when they're in their avoidancy, no way, Jose. Can you please provide some insight on what a fearful avoidant thinks differences with a dismissive avoidant? I think that a fearful avoidant is much, I'm thinking particularly with cases where I've worked with clients who have dated particularly women who are fearful avoidance. And I know one thing that is very consistent with fearful avoidance is they often say things like, how dare you think you can, claim me? You don't own me. I can do whatever I want. And they have a very strong streak of refusing to bow down to authority, of feeling like they can just do whatever they want. They don't want to feel any responsibility to someone. They have a very cavalier attitude to feeling like they need to be owned by anyone, or that they should be responsible for your feelings. I think I remember one person even said, this is what one of their attitudes was to a relationship breakup. They said, yeah, I don't think I need to explain myself to a partner. I can just leave whenever I want. They really don't care, or they don't seem to care so much about how they exit. They really seem to have a very entitled view that they can just basically do whatever they want in order to secure their own freedom from certain relationships. But I think the twisted side of being someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style is that then they really do have big fears of abandonment that come up pretty shortly after, where they crave a lot of validation, love, reassurance from someone that they're not going to leave them. But this is often the start of a hot and cold cycle. And by a hot and cold cycle with a fearful avoidant, for those that have been through it, it's the start of another new round of a situationship. One that's probably hotter and colder than the first cycle. And those of you that have dated male fearful avoidant attachers, I'd say it's usually more protracted and not as, it feels sometimes more dismissive in the sense that these individuals often feel like they have no regard for how you feel. Some of them will often come back in tears apologizing for what they've done because they do realize they've done something wrong. But it's often to try and soothe their ego, not to really reflect on how they've done something to hurt you. So I would say that it's important to understand that for a lot of these individuals that they can have differences depending on being dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance. I often find the dismissive avoidance are the ones who they don't seem to outwardly show how they're feeling nearly as much as the fearful avoidance. But one thing that is common across both types of individuals is emotional outbursts of things, meaning they can, I haven't talked about this and I want to, they can have moments where they just start to cry over seemingly simple things that you might be like, what the hell brought this on? You might ask them a question like, oh, I want to know, where do you see yourself in the next 5 years? And it caused them to burst into tears. You might ask them, hey, I wonder, do you feel like you're running away from things? And that too caused them to trigger into a very emotional moment where they're sobbing. And they may even also have these moments of genuine vulnerability where they seemingly cry at things that you're like, I can see that's sad, but I'm not like that tearful about it. And again, this is a sign of emotional dysregulation and someone having a pretty big trauma response to something that's lurking underneath. I don't usually like to label everything a trauma response, but what I would basically use to describe this as a trauma response is basically someone experiencing an unreasonably intense emotion to something seemingly very adequate. That's someone seemingly having a very big emotional moment towards something that isn't what most people might consider to be triggering. So due to their sensitivity and their emotional dysregulation, you may find that they can be very discombobulated with stuff that comes up. By the way, Science Night, thank you very much. Thank you always for your support. I very much appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. And let's see. Who becomes the one that got away? Had a dismissive avoidant who is still not over an ex from 8 years prior. The irony is I think we do. So just want to put it out there and say that they're the ones who are going to usually be laboring over us many years after the fact and emotionally regretting a lot of the stuff that happened. Whereas a lot of us, when we move past the grief and we stop blaming ourselves for things that we didn't do, we'll often look back and go, yeah, they did that to me. I'm not going to take ownership for that. I wish them all the best. Had a phenomenal time with them. They're a great human being. They seriously need to work on a lot of stuff. But I feel like I'm the one that got away. Because at the end of the day, and this book does a really good job of explaining this too, these relationships and situationship endings are mostly inevitable. So, if their attachment stuff basically causes a breakup, there was not much either of you could really do to work on it too. Like even them, they're super hijacked. They're not willing to often work on a solution, because if they were willing to work on a solution, that would mean commitment. And many of them do not want to even think about being in a committed relationship. So that's often why they're not only very conflict averse, but very solution averse to managing their, experiences. The book is called Why Men Can't Love, and I can see people have often referred to it when people have asked the question. Highly recommend it. It's probably the most validating book that I have read for someone who's been through an avoidant breakup. And for the avoidant attachers themselves, I think they will relate to it because it's such a great read. I think everyone will benefit from it. This stuff, and actually, I want to take a moment here. I made a question on my stories that a lot of people participated in, where I basically asked, should there be a form of regulation or police keeping to protect those who are unnecessarily hurt in dating? And a lot of people came forward with a really good thing that I think is maybe the better answer to this, which is we just need more education on this. If we had early intervention and education in school, even hell in university for a lot of this stuff, I really think we'd be benefiting so much and also feeling like we can actually take accountability for our side of the street and also hopefully able to cultivate much more secure relationships before it gets to a point where people often feel like it's too late, they can't work on this. I will also say that it's never too late to work on this, but people often lack the willingness and the motivation to work on it for a variety of reasons where they think it's too late for me. Oh, I don't need to do that yet. The usual things. So I think the earlier we try and teach people about this stuff, the better we will be as a society. That's my 2 cents on that. Let's see. Next one. It's been just over a year since me and my fearful avoidant ex broke up. I've been experiencing severe panic attacks whenever I see him. My body goes rigid. I get flashbacks and I cannot stop crying. My body even reacts when I hear his name. Is it likely this relationship has traumatized me? My friend, what you have just described there is a classic trauma response. You're experiencing complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So not to make light of what you're going through, that is a very real thing that you're experiencing. It's similar to what, like I was saying earlier, addicts go through when they're in recovery from hard drugs or alcohol or whatever their substance of choice may have been, in that their body is just feeling so wildly out of control. There's oxytocin withdrawal. There's also the depression and the anxiety off the back of it. There's also feeling incredibly panicked in your nervous system when you see an ex, because this person puts you in an emotional ditch. So your nervous system's not going to forget that anytime soon. And it can be re-traumatizing to see them again. So in many ways, that can also be a barrier to recovery for a lot of people. So please remember that. I can see someone here asked a question that I think I answered a bit earlier before. Similar sounding question. Are they likely to deny the whole relationship in order to break up easily? Absolutely, many of them can. What sounds better to them? Oh, we just weren't that in love. We weren't even in a relationship. We were just friends. We only dated 3 months. I don't even know why you're so brokenhearted about this. It's not like we were together anyways. Oh yeah, but I think I prefer my ex instead of you. You're not my type. I think that if I'm feeling this way, you're just not the one for me. I have spark, but I want more spark. We're not getting enough spark. Sound familiar? I should probably do a comedy sketch on this. Got an avoidant who keeps reaching out after I ended it and said no contact. Typical, how to handle, I'm ignoring. Okay, you probably don't need any further advice from me. Personally, in my situation, I would ignore because I ain't touching someone who isn't working on their stuff. I would definitely say to people that, you know, you've got to really maintain firm boundaries with individuals like this because they're not very good at maintaining their own boundaries. So please be very mindful that it is up to you often to maintain this. I know it seems like avoidant attachers, especially early on in the dating scene, seem like they know what they want. They're really like sure of themselves. And look, particularly for women, and I mean women, you know, regardless of sexuality, I think that it's an amazing thing, right, to have someone so seemingly into you, to being so, you know, obsessed with you, being so, you know, adamant to wanting to be in a relationship with you. It's amazing. And it's true that they definitely in the moment want to be with you. I think what's really scary is just how deeply confused these individuals can actually be, in that they often don't know what they want. They often don't even know where their head and their heart actually lies much of the time. Meaning that even though their love and fondness for you is genuine, actually being in a relationship and sitting with the idea of it and realizing, oh, I've got a relationship on my hands, are two completely different things. So this is why I want to go back to what I was saying earlier, which is to say, you really have to be the captain of your ship, being your relationships, when you're dealing with someone who has avoidant attachment. I know that's going to throw the polarity off for a lot of people, but just bear in mind that if you're with someone who has severe avoidant attachment, you need to be the one to call the shots. And I know a lot of people are going to have people-pleasy reactions being like, oh, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to come across as being too pushy or too needy. Don't worry. In the beginning stages, that's the last thing they're going to worry about. If anything, it's when they're activated into their avoidancy, when you even need to go harder on that and need to really focus on yourself. So just want to say that. Do they really believe that they do not love us anymore? Complicated answer, but I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, in that they tell themselves that this is for the right reason, that they don't love you anymore, that what you had was a fleeting experience. But no, because literally a few months after the fact or a few days, they'll be like, oh my God, I miss this person so much and I really feel miserable without them. And I also want to say too that it's really important to also consider the fact too that for these individuals, they know they were with you and they had a great time with you in the beginning. A lot of this is just stuff where they realize, no, I had this sudden onrush of weird like anxiety that came up out of nowhere. Nowhere. So please don't think that they don't know that you had a great time together. They do. It's just a lot of their stuff is just getting in the way of it. What can an anxious attacher do while in a relationship with an avoidant? Well, I think this is going to depend from person to person because anxious attachment, like avoidant attachment, is a bit of a spectrum in how it shows up. And I think there is a missing category for anxious attachers out there who are very independent but not as overt with their protest behaviors. They're the ones who I think sit on their wants and needs without doing anything. Anyways, that's a story for another day. Okay, if you're someone who has an anxious attachment when you're dating an avoidant, I want to make it very clear that this is probably going to be a challenge, because this is going to activate your nervous system in a lot of ways that aren't healthy. And frankly, it's probably going to lead you to be more people-pleasy, have behavior that tries to get them to give you lots of reassurance, try and act secure in order to show that you're not being too needy, have moments where you may start a fight. It's one of those things where I think it's dangerous territory depending on the level and the severity of your anxious attachment. But if you're willing to make it work, the general tips that I would say are definitely work on your boundaries. If you're feeling anxious and having an anxious flare-up, don't stop disclosing that. They're not going to leave you because you disclose how you're feeling in terms of your anxious flare-ups. If they do leave you, they'll justify that they don't like causing you grief and that maybe they were causing you too many problems and they don't like the idea of, giving you unnecessary anxiety, and that will be part of their rationalization to leave, which is not real. They're using that much of the time to validate leaving because they didn't like the idea of commitment. So that's one thing. I would also say that it's really important to process your emotions regularly. If you're starting to fantasize about your avoidant partner, hit a journal and start fantasizing about them on paper. Projecting where you think you're going to be with this person in 5-10 years, going down the aisle together, is a recipe for disaster. It is really important to fantasize outside of your relationship and not allow yourself to feel like this is running the best of you with this. Please understand that you also need to maybe have some very strict boundaries with how you interact with this person. Limit contact with them maybe to once a day for just 15 minutes just to chat with them via text, unless it's a dedicated phone call. But really treat this like you're someone who's trying not to get into the throes of love addiction. It's so important to manage how your oxytocin levels are being impacted by this. I think for those of us that with anxious attachment will know, we have a tendency to hit our own threshold for when we get to a place where our love goggles go on and we're not thinking rationally anymore. We have to be mindful of reaching that point where we lose all sense of objectivity. Challenge your thinking. Don't necessarily look for red flags. They will come if they come, but just take the time to really write out or process however you choose to what you're thinking and feeling to avoid letting your emotions get the best of you in this experience. The other thing that I would also say, that it's important to understand not to personalize your partner's behavior. Just because they're consistent, kind, loving, seemingly secure, want a relationship does not mean that that's going to eventuate. Take everything day by day. This is practice. You'll probably find that you don't get this perfectly with the first handful of people that you date, and you may find that it leads you to have avoidance style breakups, but treat them with earnest in that you are getting better at regulating and picking yourself up and also recognizing the signs, and key thing, taking it slowly. I cannot stress this enough as a recovering anxious attacher. We need to pace ourselves with this. I know Sabrina from Do the Work podcast illustrated with her partner that they found a pace that worked really well for them, and some people do. And look, to their credit, I'd say there's nothing wrong with that. If you find a pace that works with a partner where you're both able to meet your needs and make it work, fantastic. But if it's with someone who definitely has avoidant attachment, which of course we don't always know, I would just say, for yourself, take it slow. It doesn't mean you have to put limits on your dating and say, oh, no kissing or hugging or sex in 30 days. That may not be necessary, but maybe it's just more about self-monitoring and seeing, do I feel safe with this person? Do I feel unnecessarily anxious? Have I asked all relevant questions yet? I often say to a lot of my clients who've been off the back of a bad breakup, with an avoidant attacher, if your walls are as high as the Great Wall of China, let them be. You need to allow yourself to feel safe to date again. Frankly, if you reject a few people just in order to feel safe, do it. It's so important to feel safe, to actually have boundaries, to pace yourself in dating. And frankly, there are plenty of great people out there. Yes, you may miss out on one, but on the road to recovery, you probably weren't ready for a relationship like that immediately, because many of our nervous systems aren't wired for a more stable, secure love. So just saying, I would be very mindful of rushing into the next thing, which is very easy for a lot of us to do. Dating can be incredibly cathartic because you'll realize there are many amazing people after your avoidant partner, and I want to take a reminder to say, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Many avoidant attachers are phenomenal people who frankly deserve the love they got from us, and they're not going to be the only person we will meet who we will love deeply again. They're just one person on our journey, and we can thank them for their participation in this. So just wanted to say. What kind of open-ended questions can we ask to recognize if they're avoidant? Okay. How do you relate to your attachment style? What do you think of commitment? How does it feel when someone says, I love you in a relationship? What do you think of when you're dating someone and you feel as though you're about to be trapped in a relationship? I'm kidding. I'm being sarcastic. Sorry, please don't use those questions necessarily. I think the ones that I sort of use in a more gentle way might be things like, hey, I'd love to hear, how do you normally handle conflict? When you think of your last marriage, what do you think were the things you took away from that? How do you generally manage loss? What has been the hardest thing you've had to work through from your previous relationships? Now, I understand some of the stuff that I've just said sounds like a job interview. You don't probably want to ask them like a job interview. You can ask them over the course of many dates as you go through. As you go through your dating experiences. I'm just sort of reading some of the things that come up as I'm explaining stuff, so I apologize if I look a little bit distracted at times as I'm replying. My fearful avoidant ex and I broke up 18 months ago. Then he's boomeranged many times only to discard again quickly. Decorates his space with my art and gifts. Carries my poems and photos in his wallet. I don't understand why when he discards aggressively, usually after love bombing, as in why he still holds on to your stuff after just getting rid of you. Wait, let me reread that last part again. I don't understand why he discards aggressively, usually after love bombing. Oh, okay. So there's a few things that I want to say, and I've addressed these things in videos before, but for the sake of convenience, let's get through this. So first things first. Avoidant attachers may not relinquish your house keys, your teddy bear, your possessions, your belongings, because they still feel that they still want to hold on to you, the memory of you, without necessarily saying no to you, but they also don't want to be close to you. 2, they also, I find, typically, if they do come back around, have much more intense periods where they find like it's a much shorter experience than the first time round because their fears of intimacy and commitment hit them harder and faster this time. And so they back out much harder and faster. And it can be even more traumatic than the first breakup. So that's why I think it's important to understand that a lot of this stuff is done out of a place of, I don't want to let you go out of my life, but I don't want to be close to you. So his emotions are dictating how he relates to you, and he is not in control of a lot of this stuff. He's in control in terms of how he's making you feel and your response to this, and he really needs a therapist. But in this particular case, he's neither wanting to let go of you completely, but also not wanting to fully commit to you because of his own fears. So that's what's going on there. And let's see. Would you agree that extreme avoidants objectify people and use them to cover their own needs without caring for the partner and friend? When you say they objectify people as in, oh, actually, yes. I think I know an example of what you're talking about, and my answer is yes. So I'm going to paint an example and I'll talk about what I mean. Sometimes avoidant attachers will say things like, oh, my partner's fit, or my partner's really hot. And they sort of talk about the superficialities of the person they're with. Oh, I really like their smile. Oh, I really like them in bed. Without really talking about much depth and quality and color to the relationship. So if that's the experience that you're talking about, yes. And again, this is a way of avoiding, fuller commitment. Because if you're only talking about the niceties, you never really have to talk about why we're in a romantic relationship in the first place. If your preference is that you want to talk about the nice, shallow stuff, nothing wrong with that if that's your preference. But I know a lot of people aren't looking for that kind of romantic relationship where their butt's the subject of conversation for their friends and family. Usually they're looking for, I love my partner because I love the way they make me feel. They're kind, they're genuine, they're empathetic, they're consistent. I really enjoy the fact that they show up for me when I'm having a bad time. So I just want to say yes to that question. I think I've answered those questions. I was the wife in this situation. My ex was still keeping me there for months while seeing someone else when we were on a break. I forgave him when he came back, and now he's left me again and treating me so badly and so cold. Will he ever feel bad at how he has treated me? Yes and no. Not right now, because he's probably justifying getting away from you. He sees you as public enemy number one and is probably not going to consider the fact that he's done the wrong thing. But I can tell you, a lot of these people will have a moment where they do realize what they've done is wrong. I'm going to paint an example of this because I know what you're describing is a very common story that I have heard many times over from clients. To those of you who've been out there who know what I'm about to talk about, have you ever been in a relationship where you are married or in a significant relationship with a partner who you suspect has avoidant attachment? They've gotten so cold at times that it's almost like they just can't stand being around with you, where at one point in time, they could have, given up so much to be with you, they were wanting to spend every day with you, but now it's almost like they're just distancing themselves so much to the point where it seems like their hobbies, their friends, their work has more of a priority in their lives than being intimate with you. Then you also realize they're cheating on you. And you get to a point where you eventually maybe give them an ultimatum and say, all right, if this continues, I'm going to walk. You need to go to therapy. Otherwise, I'm leaving. And for some reason, it seems like they've become an anxious attacher all of a sudden and are becoming extremely needy and wanting to be with you again and doing anything to change. This is a very common scenario that occurs when you've dated an avoidant attacher in a long-term relationship. This is an experience where the avoidant attacher, to manage their own insecurities of being in an intimate relationship that's gone on into a very long-term phase, is cheating in order to feel a sense of freedom and space from you. Often, they may complain about you and say, oh, they're so rigid, they're so cold, we don't have any good sex anymore, they're not even my type, when in fact, these are things that may not actually be true about you in the relationship. They may not actually believe any of that stuff, and part of them may know I'm making this shit up, but for them in the moment, because of how angry they feel at feeling so unworthy, discombobulated being in a relationship, they think you're the problem. You're making them feel this way. You've done something to make them feel this. So often they will rationalize to hell as to why this just isn't working out for me. For the woman they're dating, having an affair with, they often become the next person to go through a round of this cycle too. I've worked with many people who have been I don't want to say the other woman because I feel like that's a very negative and pejorative term. So I'm going to say more kindly, they become the next individual to be impacted by this person's commitment phobia and also bear the brunt of the same experience when that person gets close. A lot of the time, the avoidant attacher, due to their own commitment phobia, can drive their partner batshit crazy. Sometimes physical violence can also erupt as well. I'm not justifying physical violence. I don't think anyone deserves to be hit or attacked by anyone. Unfortunately, it happens as a consequence of how maddening this is. So I'm just saying it happens. I'm not normalizing it. I think we should never get to a situation where that happens. It happens. Because, as I'm sure many people know, do you know how fucked it is to be in a situation where you feel like you're going mad because of how someone's created a story in their head that you're the problem when you've never done anything wrong in your life and they're blaming you for things that you've never done wrong? Again, as one person asked me earlier, don't you think that's consistent with cluster B sort of territory with people who are narcissists? To which my answer is, yes, I do. I don't think anyone should be on the receiving end of crazy-making behavior that they didn't sign up for. It's not narcissism, but it's sure damn similar in the thick of it for people who are in this situation. So, unfortunately, I'd say that this is an all too common scenario, particularly for straight couples. The LGBTQIA plus sort of sees a different variation of this, where the relationship is usually opened up, and it's more of a case of let's navigate polyamory or let's navigate ethical non-monogamy before the avoidant cheats with one of the partners and goes off to be in a relationship with them. So we see a slightly different variation of that tale. Why do they want to stay friends after a breakup? Because they want you emotionally but don't want to commit. You couldn't have said it better yourself. That's exactly right. Similar to the keys that belong to your house, your teddy bear. These are real examples I'm using, by the way. They don't necessarily know what to do with you. Sometimes they're like, well, I still want access to you, but oh, this is a kicker. But maybe in a year, we can rethink things, but not right now, because I'm still finding myself. I don't know if I want to be in a relationship. I feel as though I'm still discovering myself. I'm just really feeling like anytime I'm in a relationship, I was losing myself in it, and I just need time. So maybe in 5 years, we can renegotiate. They don't even know in 5 years if they're going to want this. So I definitely say be very mindful that this is a very common experience. I can see someone here has said, I haven't caught up with the full live yet, but I assume this book is discussing fearful avoidance too, right? I want to make it clear, the book actually never uses the terms avoidant attachment. It never delineates even between the fearfuls and also the dismissives. This was a book that came out probably around the same time the Strange Test was being done. I'm sketchy on dates. But the Strange Test was the one that was done to identify anxious, avoidant, secure bonds between kids and their parents. And I don't think at that particular point in time it had been fully formed as a theory that was something that connected to adult relationships at the time. So this was sort of the language that was used to describe this. And similarly, love addiction and women who love too much was the pejorative way of describing anxious attachment that was identified in straight women, which was also, you know, what we now probably more readily call codependency. So I just want to make it clear, this is a dated book. But it's stuff, we're still, in a sense, imagine we're all in the dark, we're all touching an elephant. We know that we're touching the ears, the trunk, the body of it, but we're all giving it a different name, but we're still describing the same beast. So even though they're not referring specifically to avoidant attachers, it's still the same concept. And it's the same thing even when they refer to the fact at the acknowledgements that this is something that people need to work through with like love addiction related stuff, because it all connects. So it's all part of it, even though we're using different words to describe the same animal. That leads me on to now talk about something completely unrelated. Has anyone noticed a big ratio of secure and anxious folk who are coming here, but not many avoidant attachers actually wanting to work on this stuff? Those of you who are avoidantly attached who are coming here and looking at this stuff, I know how bloody hard it is to work on this stuff, so I want to just give you a massive thumbs up and a thank you for the work you're doing. But many of them do not come to therapy to work on this stuff because, again, it goes into that place of they don't want to acknowledge they have a problem. Everyone else has got the problem, I do not have the problem. So I want to make it clear that for every avoidant attacher who's doing the work, fucking phenomenal, because it is seriously, you are doing an amazing job for yourself, and you and your relationships will benefit greatly from it. And there are unfortunately a staggering number of individuals with avoidant attachment who resist therapy, resist looking at themselves, and don't want to work on themselves. So I'm just trying to paint a picture here to say many of us are doing the work on behalf of those that won't be here. A cliche story, but true. Oh yeah, I can see someone here saying, my fearful avoidant ex had multiple therapists, but yet gave me trauma. This is a great moment to clarify that just because an avoidant attacher sees a therapist, we don't necessarily know what their history and context of therapy has been. I have known many clients, I know many stories of avoidant attachers who've done exactly the same thing to their partners, to their therapists, where they're like, yeah, I just haven't found the right therapist yet. Or even worse, the therapist, without realizing it, it's not the therapist's fault, has maybe gone too fast. I've done this with some avoidant clients because, again, avoidant attachers, usually when they're seeing therapists, rush. And they're like, I want to work on this, I want to work on this. And I've had to actually put the brakes on a lot of my avoidant clients and say, hold up a minute. We need to slow this right down and we need to take things one step at a time because that challenges their nervous system. And actually often I find has a much better long-term relationship with them where they realize, oh, I can actually do commitment. What a surprise. So I'm just putting that out there to say that If you're a clinician in this space, slow is best. If you're dating an avoidant attacher, slow is also best. It doesn't guarantee they'll stick around, but it's definitely helping them in their recovery journey and also them in dating. Because there are still there are some avoidant attachers who do want to work on their side of the street with this. So we can't make it seem like everyone's a lost cause, because that's not true. But many of them, because of this, I know it's called style, don't necessarily want to work on this. Do drug-addicted, fearful avoidants manage to leave the addiction, or is it impossible for them? Actually, yes. Yes, they can. And I say that because I've worked with clients with a fearful avoidant attachment style who have quit their main addiction. That in itself is sort of like what we'd call a secondary addiction, because I think a lot of them, or maybe it's their primary, but basically, yes. Sorry, let me start that over. There are many avoidant attachers who've been to 12-step recovery programs and have learned to overcome their addiction issues. But just like commitment-related problems, they have to be willing and wanting to work on that stuff. Otherwise, it dooms them to a life of misery, and it's not a particularly healthy way for them to go. So, down to each person, I'm afraid. I can see I've got many more questions, which is great. I became very avoidant in the breakup with my fearful avoidant ex. After they broke up with me, I'm anxious usually, and he became very angry and clingy, trying to be friends, saying, "What about me?" Can fearful avoidants truly believe they weren't at fault in the relationship if the other person blocks them? Yes, they can. And for fearful avoidants, I'd say they're the ones who become, unlike dismissives, who are often like, well, it's for the best, and I mean, I think they'll do better off without me. The fearful avoidants are often very possessive of their partners and hate if you give a sense of closure. They often become incredibly upset with that because a lot of them still want access to you. So they may be the ones who say, we can still be friends, but I'd feel upset if you were to date someone else. They have a funny thing where on one hand, they may say things like, oh yeah, you can date whoever you want, but they don't really mean that. They often spiral if you start dating someone else. They may get really jealous, start messaging you furiously if you start dating another person, become incredibly insecure to the point where they're maybe coming up to you in tears saying, I love you, I can't believe you did this to me. And it may feel like you're dealing with someone who's an extreme anxious attacher, but ironically, you're not. You're dealing with someone who has a need for a lot of external validation, someone who also needs a lot of reassurance, and someone who doesn't know what to do with you because of their own fears of intimacy and commitment. So that's unfortunately a lot of the case for this sort of stuff too. Thanks for this live. It sounds like I've had a trauma response to a breakup. Now what? My answer is you probably want to speak to someone. You probably want to educate yourself a lot on this. You also want to have a lot of time to yourself to work through this breakup. A lot of it is challenging your inner critic. A lot of it, I did a video on that earlier in the week talking about the beliefs that come up, being like, I wasn't good enough. Maybe if I was prettier, smarter, sexier, they would still be with me, which is not true. You actually wouldn't have been able to influence it even if you were a bit sexier, prettier, hotter, whatever the word is that your inner critic is coming up with. I know our inner critics then jump to, well, maybe they were just being nice. They didn't want to tell me how it really was. Okay, let's challenge that for a hot second. How psychotic do you have to be to date someone and not be honest with yourself that you don't like this person and you're still choosing to date them? That's pretty people-pleasy and not okay. Some people do that. Frankly, I wouldn't want to date them because they're not being honest. But the truth is often more complicated than that, and our brains are often trying to fill the gaps in with logic, and our inner critics often do a great job of being, frankly, a little bitch to us and trying to say things like, oh, well, if they wanted to, they would. Really? Is that really what's actually going on? Because there's usually a lot of evidence to suggest they did want you in the beginning, but something shifted for them that may have been an internal thing. We're not always responsible for our relationship hiccups. Sometimes it actually is just the other person. Devil's advocacy doesn't always have a place in some of these dynamics. Well, my answer, I suppose, goes to how to recover our self-esteem after being dumped by a fearful avoidant. Excuse me. can feel incredibly educated on issue and know a lot on the intellectual level, but still feel emotionally lost. What therapies do you recommend EMDR? Okay, so this is a really good point. And it relates to the very last couple of questions I answered. I'm going to be honest. The emotional stuff is the hardest thing to work through off the back of this breakup. You may have a lot of the rational stuff to be like, okay, I get why they do this, but I'm still beating myself up about this. I would say that working with a therapist who understands attachment, inner critic work is not something that I would say is cognitive behavioral therapy related, even though it can be a bit similar. But I think you definitely need to speak with a therapist who at least has an understanding of attachment, maybe does internal family systems, understands avoidant attachment and how that can also traumatize people. I think EMDR can be good, but in my experience listening to clients' stories, it hasn't always been a guarantee. I know some clients who found it to be amazing, but you have to eventually challenge a lot of that negative thinking that you weren't good enough. Just like an avoidant attacher has a negative voice in their head telling them that they were never going to be, good enough for you, that they were always going to be a failure, that they weren't going to be a good person. We often tend to bias ourselves in these moments and say, we weren't good enough. That is our curse to bear and to be liberated from, because that is not always the case. So I'd say you can definitely try doing that on your own, but I would recommend speaking to a specialist. That's how it helped me get out of this. And I had to do a lot of journaling with my inner critic to get it to shut the fuck up. And now it's in a position where I'm like, thank God it's on my side. It's not tearing me apart. And if anything, it's very much an advocate. I know a lot of this stuff is going to sound woo to the lay person, but I also want to say, once you get an understanding of this and you really start to work on this stuff, you're going to find that it's not just the breakup that you're working through, it's a lot of things in your life that you're also unlearning as well too. So consider this the gateway to many great things that come off the back of this. Ooh, as a fearful avoidant, how do I get over the intimacy stuff? I can even go on a fourth date because I'm already running the other direction and then all over again. Okay, I don't know if I can give you a very good answer because it sounds to me like... because I'm already running... Oh, okay, because it sounds like even on the fourth date, you're already running in the other direction. Okay, I think this is going to have to depend on context. So let me paint a picture just to see if this sounds anywhere similar to your example. If you're in a position where you find that on the fourth date, let's just say you've had a great date. You've been out on a date, you've showered this person with love, they're really liking you, and they're saying things like, yeah, I really see a future with you too. Usually that can be the trigger. There's something about how there's some sort of form of like future, commitment, something sets you off, and you'll probably be like, oh God, no, this is too much. I'm going to just lay it on you and say, you're probably not going to be able to unlearn that on your own. You probably want to speak to someone about that because your challenge is not so much one of how do you become more secure. It's more about how do you teach your brain to not relate to anything that gives you the fear of commitment, to cause your body to shut down and to get a real fight or flight response. That's more trauma stuff. I can't unfortunately wave a wand and be like, just don't panic when you think of commitment, because the problem is that seems to be something that's really triggering. So I definitely think that you really need to speak with someone to unlearn a lot of that stuff. And if you're also finding that even on the fourth date, you just want to run, that does sound like it's quite, I don't want to use the word severe, but maybe that's the best word I can use. It does sound like that's quite intense. So I would argue that if your mind is that good at finding excuses to run at that particular point in time, you really want to speak to someone and to start actually working through that, because you're potentially going to find more dates are going to be like that. And I know for many avoidant attachers, when they hear that, they often try and convince themselves this isn't an issue. They'll jump into a new relationship with someone just to convince themselves that this isn't really a thing. Believe me, if you feel like you're already scrutinizing a person on the fourth date, it's only going to happen again. please speak to someone is what I would say. An internal family systems therapist is usually what's recommended for people with avoidant attachment, and often I find that it works really well for them too. Take it slow. Really take the time to work through a lot of that stuff that's going on that's causing you to attack the other person, to find excuses to back away. Do fearful avoidants cry when you smartly cry and make them realize what they lost by losing you? Well, as in, do fearful avoidants cry when you almost like forced yourself to cry as a way of getting them to react to you leaving them entirely? I mean, they might. Do fearful avoidants cry? Now I can see this as a correction. Do fearful avoidants cry when you smartly talk and make them realize what they've lost by losing you? Yes. A lot of avoidant attachers have a lot of distress when they realize they're choosing victimhood and worse scenarios than to commit with you. Many times they're the ones crying when they break up with you, and you're like, why the hell are you crying? You're the one choosing to break up with me. If you're so distressed by this, why are you choosing to break up with me? Part of them doesn't want to break up, but the overriding part of them, which is the fear response, is the one that's motivating them to get the hell out of this. Their brain's telling them to run. So unfortunately, you can often see this real flip-flop emotions play out, and it's pretty discombobulating to receive, because you're like, what the hell is going on with this person? I'm the one being impacted by this, not them. But they are actually being deeply impacted by this. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there. I'm going to answer one more question. I'm going to call it a night, because I can see I've been on here for about an hour and 45 minutes. Not that I mind, by the way. It's been a fun live, but it's just one where I need to take care of myself too. Let's see. My dismissive avoidant used to talk about our future in the start and abruptly broke up saying, we don't have a connection. Well, this is an easy one to answer. Okay, so if a dismissive avoidant is telling you, yeah, we didn't have a connection, like I said in one of my previous lives, I'm putting my stamp of denial on that one. No. Again, let's look at the context. If you've dated this person, they've said, they've acted, behaved, spoken in such a way where they've, brought you along into this situationship or relationship where you really felt like they were wanting to see you, they were calling you all the time, they were doing, great things for you, wonderful acts of service, and then they tell you abruptly, yeah, we don't have a connection. Bullshit. That's their fear talking, because they don't want to take accountability for it. Anyways, guys, I'm going to go. It's been great. I've loved being here today. Final reminder, if you jumped on late, the entirety of this live was to do a bit of a breakdown of a case that I pulled out from the book, Why Men Can't Love. Phenomenal book about avoidant attachment and the impact of being on the receiving end of this. Highly recommend you all check it out. So much better than Attached, in my opinion. I know I say that a lot to the books that I read on this subject, because as you sort of go down the rabbit hole, you find better ones as well. This book was actually shared with me by a follower, and I just want to say thank you so much to them privately, because I really appreciate the shared knowledge that's being thrown around this community. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day wherever they are. I am going to save this live now for anyone who wants repeated viewing. But again, very much appreciate all of you people who are part of this community, not only because it validates what I've been through, but I think it validates a lot of what people are going through in this experience. And it's wonderful to be able to support so many people. Thank you very much. See you next time.